Welcome. It's so nice to have you back. I'm Mary Davidson, and it's our community, and we have such interesting neighbors. And I would like for you to meet my neighbor, and his name is Chris Turner. And Chris is visiting because on and off since 1967, Chris has been in Afghanistan. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you very much, Mary. I appreciate it.
I'm delighted to have you. And we are going to talk about Afghanistan, the state of what it was, the state of what it is, and what Chris thinks it's going to be. So I will start out and tell these people that I don't know if they saw the article in the newspaper or not, but it had your picture, Mr. Chris,
yes,
and you were holding, it was at an AK-47?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes. Aren't you proud? I knew what it was. And they had a disturbance in Kabul at the hotel.
Correct. The guest house was attacked by the terrorists a year ago, October, and they unfortunately were able to get inside the building and kill 24 people, Afghans and Europeans and Americans. And I was lucky enough to get out the back of the building with a couple of dozen people and contain them in a laundry room while the battle went on. And then 20 minutes into the fight, the last of the 9 armed guards that we had died. So I was the last man with a gun, so I was able to defend these 24 people and kill the last suicide bomber before he exploded himself.
Well, and was that not lucky?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I picked up the morning paper, and I saw Chris's picture on there. I thought, laws of mercy, that's my neighbor. And I, we were all just kind of a Twitter in the neighborhood, Chris. You must understand that. But I want to talk about Afghanistan as it was. When you first went there in 1967, what was that country like?
You know, my training in America in college was in art and film, and I was doing some film production locally, doing TV commercials, and I had the equipment, 16 mil. So I decided to go to Afghanistan. As an artist, I was so captured by the country because it really hadn't changed culturally. It hadn't really become westernized at all. So they're wearing their tradition. They're literally living the way Muhammad lived 1,400 years ago. So as a cameraman or artist, it was so unique that I really wanted to capture it. So I was able to get small contracts with National Geographic and some other European broadcast companies. And so I shot documentaries concerning the nomads and just concerning the general lifestyle.
Now, were most of the people nomadic? Or?
Well, you know, the Pashtus, the tribe that I studied and lived with, most of them were at one time.
Are they now?
No, you know, unfortunately, because of the Russian occupation, it changed drastically. But at the time, it was in '67, it was the largest nomadic tribe in the world, 6 million people. There was not one fat one, not one deformed one, no doctors, no vaccine, no medicine. So it was selective breeding. Only the fittest lived to be 14 to reproduce and survive. And I think it's typified so by that beautiful green-eyed girl, that 12-year-old girl that National Geographic photographed and put on the cover of their magazine and then used to promote their magazine for 20 years.
Now, there's one tribe that has blonde hair and gray. Is that not true?
Well, you know, Hitler actually claimed when he was there trying to kind of take over in the 30s that they were the beginning of the Aryan race, because there are a lot of red-headed, light-skinned, blue-eyed. Well, you know, they said perhaps the Greeks.
Yeah.
You know, Alexander conquered didn't really conquer, but he inhabited a large area there, especially up in an area they call Nuristan. They still wear.
That's in the north, isn't it?
Yes, up in the mountains in the very far north, and they've only been Muslim for 100 years.
Really?
Yeah, so they were, you know, a separate sovereign country necessarily.
But they do not have Semitic features. They're blonde and redheads and so
a mix, quite a mix. The people are. They really are. But beautiful people, just based on that selective breeding concept.
So they were basically nomadic. Very tribal in 1967 when you went there.
Yes.
Still growing poppies.
Well, you know, actually the opium business was introduced really more by the Americans. We were very intent on addicting the Russian soldiers to heroin. You know, when I was first in Kandahar in 1967, there was no poppy.
Really?
They had hashish, which was their choice as... You know, Muhammad neglected to mention that drug. He said sharab, or alcohol, was a sin and punishable by death. I think the punishment is the crowds to pull you into pieces and throw you into the trees for the birds to eat if they catch you with a beer.
That's not fun.
I can't imagine.
No.
But so I think the need for people to have some kind of libation hash was accepted. The only opium I ever saw was grown in the north, more of a Chinese influence, and it was used for diarrhea, and they ate it in its very crudest form.
Well, opium as a medicine, a medicinal drug in early America was used as well to take care of certain things.
Yeah. And that was the only use I saw for it. It wasn't something people were addicted to necessarily. In fact, in Iran at the time, it was legal if you were over 65 to smoke opium. They sold the pipes and the drugs in pharmacies, and it was kind of their Medicare.
What kind of government did you see when you were there in '67?
You know, the Pashtus are the dominant tribe. There are 5 tribes that have a presence there. The Pashtus, the Tajiks, the Uzbeks, the Turkmens, and the Baluch. But the Pashtus have always been the majority tribe, and they're also been the fiercest fighters. They've been the ones that have defended Afghanistan. The word Afghan is a Pashtu word. They've defended Afghanistan from the British, from the Greeks, from everybody for centuries.
Now, are the Tajiks from Tajikistan?
Basically, Tajikistan was captured by the Russians and given a separate name. You know, the word stan means land. So there's Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan.
Well, and the Uzbeks are another tribe.
Another tribe that's partially in Afghanistan and partially in their own country. In fact, when the Taliban took over Mazar, which is the northern capital of Afghanistan, so to speak, they wrote on the country gates, Uzbeks go back to Uzbekistan, Turkmens go back to Turkestan, Tajiks go back to Tajikistan, and the Azoris go to Kabistan, which was the graveyard, the grave land.
That's not good.
The Azoris were kite runner. That was a minority tribe that was so subjugated, put into slavery by the Pashtuns.
And those are the people that they talked about in the Kite Runner
yes,
book?
Yes,
because that was a wonderful book. It was.
The Azoris.
Things have changed a little.
Yes, ma'am.
The Russians began to come in. I know you were there when the Russians were there. How did Afghanistan change when the Russians came?
Well, you know, I think it was, again, they were called to arms, this is, you know, happened to them over the centuries. And they're fierce fighters, extremely independent people, haven't ever been subjugated by any
very
culture.
Tribal.
Very tribal, but the Pashtus, that's a large tribe. You know, that's literally, if you look at the Pashtus between the Pak side and the Afghan side, that's 40 million people.
Yeah, that's a lot.
So it's a big
people.
tribe.
Yeah, that is a lot of people. So okay, the Russians came in, and they had to fight again.
Yeah, and they did the same thing we did. They put their bases up north, which is really in the Tajik territory and the Uzbek territory, and they're easier tribes to deal with because they have a certain hostility towards the Pashtus anyway. So it was easy for us as occupiers, so to speak, to befriend the Tajiks and use that northern area, Kabul.
And you're talking about the Russians now.
Yeah, the Russians and the Americans both.
Yeah.
We've done the same thing. We've used these people as our allies. That's why they killed Massoud, the famous leader of the Northern Alliance, a week before the trade towers. Yeah. They executed him. That was the very first time.
They being who?
Al-Qaeda. Okay. That was the first time a suicide bomber was used in Afghanistan, and it wasn't Afghans. It was 2 Moroccans. So this is in 2000, they had never used, or 2001, they'd never used a suicide bomber in that country. The Russians fought there for 10 years, and it was never considered a defense or an arsenal.
But the Russians didn't get very far. They left. I mean,
well, they were there 10 years.
But
and
what
they
did they accomplish in 10 years?
Yeah, they alienated. You know what they accomplished is they accomplished they drove out all these nomads across the Pakistani border into these terrible refugee camps that were then influenced by bin Laden and the Wahhabis, the radical Muslim sect, Al-Qaeda, because they built these madrasas and gave these poor people that had nothing, gave their sons 1 meal a day. But they had to be subjected to very distorted religious training that bred a whole 2 or 3 generations now of suicide bombers.
Now, are you talking about the Wahhabis that are in Saudi Arabia?
Yeah,
okay.
And actually Saudi Arabia is funding these madrasas. This is not bin Laden's money. Al-Qaeda is not something that generates money. It's being funded. You know, and it's been, you know, if you live and work in that part of the world, you realize that they're the ones funding it.
And let's go back to the madrasa again. The whole philosophy, and you're talking about taking uneducated, very poor, and educating them the way you wish them to be. And it's an easy thing to do, you know. Through the years, all of these movements that have come up have looked at people who are hungry people. You know, Karl Marx said, you give them bread and then you give them indoctrination.
Yeah.
And I think the madrasas have worked that way too, because the Wahhabis are smart.
Oh,
I mean,
yeah.
they're, you know, they have spawned an awful lot of hate and trouble in this world, Chris.
No, they have, and you know, and I pointed that out to the people that I was dealing with the government in the 70s and 80s, that this was a problem. I lived with bin Laden. He was in the same Mujahideen camp that I was in 1985 for a month.
What kind of a person was he, Chris?
You know, he was very educated, spoke English fluently,
Well,
was
yes.
learning
Now, he was
Pashto.
a Saudi, yes, yes.
He was learning Pashto. He was 27, I believe, at the time. It was his first trip into battle. He wasn't a coward, because these men fought all the time, and bin Laden would fight. But even then, he complained to me about how the Americans had corrupted his Saudi brothers with our oil money. You know, he had literally made it plain to me that he resented us changing their life so drastically with this infusion of cash and making them bad Muslims. You know, they'd go to France, they'd drink alcohol, they'd party on their big yachts, and then they'd come back.
Well, he wasn't incorrect about that, Chris.
No, he was correct. He was correct. And as a, you know, and again, I think this is what we all have to realize. And I work with the Taliban. This company I work for now is an Afghan Taliban-owned company. And they've worked for the U.S. government for 8 years. Have done 53,000 truck missions for them. So the Taliban's not all bad. I brought my tribal leader to Congress. He testified in front of Senator Tierney, or Congressman Tierney. And he said, the first thing he said is, I'm Taliban. And he is. That's a religious student.
Okay, but you're separating the Pakistani Taliban
I have.
from
I
the
have.
Afghani Taliban.
And the Afghan Taliban does that. They separate them. They say that that's where the trouble is. We go very peacefully through the winter. As soon as they can come across the mountain passes in the spring, they attack us. And we suddenly have mayhem everywhere. And it's every winter like that. So it's obvious to me that the Afghan Taliban want jobs, they want security, they want their country to run properly. We should attack Pakistan. That's what the Afghans tell me. In fact, the Pakis were attacking Afghanistan. I don't know if you saw that in the news.
Yes.
Last month, they put in 1,800 rockets across the Paki border into the Afghan side. And they said, they said that was the Taliban that did that. Yet it went on for weeks and they couldn't stop them. And where does the Taliban get 1,800 rockets? I mean, it was unfathomable that it wasn't the Paki.
Let's look at the underlayment on this. Do you believe that all of this, what drives this problem? Is it religion? Is it economics? Is it greed? Is it power? What is it that drives this? It's strong within these people. I mean, like it or not, it is strong. And so what drives that? Well,
you mentioned the reasons. It's all those reasons, and they all work together. And the Pashtus are, God bless them, they're very simple people. I mean, these are nomads. No formal education of any sort 40 years ago when I first met them. You know, a little bit now because they've been corrupted by the Russians. I say corrupted. Their lifestyle's been changed.
Yes.
So now they're in flux. They're not really this anymore, but yet they're not that. So I think the powers to be, the Wahhabis, have taken advantage of them. They're very easy to train.
Are there a lot of the Wahhabis in Afghanistan now?
Well, not in Afghanistan. They're managing those refugee camps, the areas around Quetta and Peshawar and that whole border area. That
so it's kind of in the
no man. They call it the tribal territory.
The tribal territory.
The northwest frontier.
That's right, but that's in Pakistan.
Yes, it is. And the Durand Line, which was created in 1902, was a 100-year lease. So it actually ran out in 2002.
And I think it's just absolutely fascinating. It was created by the Pakistanis because they didn't know what to do with all these.
No, it wasn't really created by the Pakis. The word Pakistan means clean. Pak means clean. Stan land. So the British created a country called Clean Land.
So they didn't know what to do with these people.
They wanted to separate the Muslims from the Hindus. So they cleaned up the religious turmoil by creating Pakistan. So all the Muslims ran into Pakistan that were in the Indian side, and all the Hindus ran into India that were on the Paki side. Because actually India, or the old colony that British had conquered, went all the way to Peshawar, which is in the Pashto territory.
Yeah.
They couldn't get through the Khyber Pass, the very famous.
That's right.
But, you know, I think in general they wanted to weaken Afghanistan by dividing it up. So I think it was a very political thing on their part to create the Durand Line, which took half of the Pashto tribe and put them on one side, half on the other side. And
so divide and conquer was the idea?
I think so. I mean, I think that's obviously what they've been able to do. Yeah. And I think right now, today, if we look at Pakistan, probably one of the most corrupt countries in the world, and it doesn't have any national pride. It was created 100 years ago by colonists that they didn't want there. You know, really it should be called Pashtunistan, or at least that area that's causing us trouble now.
Isn't it interesting, though, that we cannot talk about, we keep ranging back over that border, we cannot seem to talk about Afghanistan today, or in Russian and then going on down, without talking about Pakistan.
Yeah, and I think
it's really difficult to separate the problems there.
Well, because it is one tribe.
Yeah.
And you have half of them on one side and half the other. So as Mr. Waziristani, one of the leaders of that province that's so famous, said, my feet are in Pakistan and my head's in Afghanistan when I sleep. So they don't see a border there. It's a natural.
Well, but nomadic peoples don't
see borders anyway.
No.
Exactly.
And we try to change that mindset, and it's almost impossible.
Haven't we settled all the nomads? Think of the Romas in Europe, the Gypsies, the Greeks. We've settled. The civil governments can't tax them, can't draft them, can't count them.
That's right.
Can't control them.
Now there's the operative phrase, can't control them. And
so
that's difficult.
They're problematic.
Yeah.
In so many ways.
Well, now the Russians didn't succeed very well, but between the Russians and the Americans coming, there was a period. What happened? You were in and out of there.
And I think that was probably one of the most troublesome periods, because what happened was you'd funded several large Mujahideen guerrilla groups, and that was the Americans that had funded them. So you had these combating warlords.
Where did they get these people? Were they Pashtuns?
Yeah, they were Pashtu warlords, and we funded the Northern Alliance, was Tajiki. We funded General Dostum, who's Uzbeki. So we funded, leaders from all the tribes in a common effort to fight the Russians. And I will say, during that Russian combat, that was probably as unified as Afghanistan has ever been, because they all had a common enemy. So they were all fighting the same cause. Well, once that common enemy left, then they started fighting each other. And
because,
Kabul,
again, that tribal mentality comes back.
Exactly. Different languages, different cultures, different, actually, I won't say different religions, but what you do have is you have Sunnis and Shias.
Well, and that in and of itself is problematic.
A big problem. So you have not only tribal, as you say, tribal differences, you have religious differences. So, basically they fought, and they fought over Kabul, because Kabul has been a symbol of leadership in that country, or the capital of that country.
Well, when we say capital, is that a loosely used term?
It really is, because the spiritual capital for the Pashtus has always been Kandahar. And when the Taliban took over Afghanistan, that's where the capital was. Mullah Omar had his palace in Kandahar, not in Kabul. He shunned Kabul. He felt that was Tajiki territory or Western territory. It was not the true Afghanistan.
I guess I keep coming back and underscoring tribal, because it seems to me very difficult to make a country that is basically, I don't care what you say, they're basically nomads still, even if they're in one place.
The mentality is the same.
Their head is in a different place. So they're basically nomadic, very tribal, and to make a democracy, and that was our intent. Now, we had a period between the Russians and the Americans, and then we came in and we wanted to make a democratic country. Is that doable, Chris?
It was interesting, when they had the big election for Parliament, these people are illiterate, so they didn't have signs with your name on it. It had your picture, and then they gave you a symbol.
Well, but that's right. But it's your
And the symbol could be maybe 3 pins or 4 ladders or 5 pails, or and that was your symbol. Good guys had like 5 horses. If you were lucky, you got a good symbol.
Yeah.
So that's when you went to the ballot box, you were tied to that symbol. So
how did they, when they did their campaigning, however they did it, how did they tie themselves to their symbol? How did they do that?
Well, through billboards, giant, everywhere you drove along the road, and the back of cars, loudspeakers with fans. But again, it was very tribal. The election was very tribal. So you have 200 members of parliament that all represent different interest groups. So there's really no harmony there either. The government in general, and I say this with some caution, but it's the world considers it the second most corrupt government in the world. It's been classified as. So it's a complete failure.
Karzai is corrupt, you think?
Oh, it's the second most corrupt government. Nigeria, I think, is the only one. And it's funny, the Afghans won't even let Nigerians in. You can't get a visa if you're Nigerian.
Well, how about, Karzai's brother, Wali Karzai, was killed.
Yeah, I've met him several times. He was a close friend of one of the gentlemen I work with.
So if I met him, what would I think of him?
A very jolly guy, nice guy. The Pashtus are extremely hospitable. He wouldn't be able to deal with you very easily as a female.
I understand that, yes.
Pashtu Wali, or that legendary ethics that they put on women, is your brother can't see your wife. And if a man does see your wife, you have the right to kill him.
Really?
Yes.
That's kind of harsh.
It is a little harsh.
But that is a problem, Chris.
It is.
We need to go back to that, because, we're kind of flirting with the issue, but we have a huge population of women who are in every way disenfranchised.
Yeah.
Now, that's not good.
The gentleman I work for a nomadic tribe. He's the tribal leader. His father died. He's only 30 when he took over the tribal. Small tribe, about 1.5 million people. They don't count heads, they count houses now that they're not nomadic. And his wife, who he married when she was 15, is a first cousin. And he brought her to his compound the night of the wedding, and she's never seen the street in front of her house. She's had 5 children and never left the compound.
But I believe, I don't care what you want to do with the country. If you want to raise it up as a tribal country, as a democratic country, as whatever kind of country you want, you have to educate these women. I mean, they're really disenfranchised. They are non-entities, non-citizens.
But you know, and I've spoken to the government, to the U.S. government about this issue. I think we're going to do a coalition with the Taliban, which is inevitable because they control the country now.
Now you're talking about the Afghani
the Taliban. You know, this is it's the Afghan and the Pakistani. The Afghan and the Pakistani, and they really don't work together. The Pakis are causing most of the violence. The suicide bombers are all being bred over there and then sold. You can buy
in the madrasas.
Yes, you can buy a suicide bomber for $20,000, and they'll deliver him where you want him. So these different guerrilla groups aren't developing their own suicide bombers. They're buying them.
They are
as young as 10 years old.
Yeah,
old enough to wear the vest.
Yeah.
You know.
So do you think the future for women in Afghanistan is
dismal? Is dismal. We're not going to change that. And I think we have to realize that that's something we can't do. And you mentioned it earlier. We can't change these people's culture. We're not that powerful. We don't have that much time. You know.
We don't have that much time and
money, influence, nothing. So the women, we're going to have to compromise on that issue.
Well.
If we're going to have a coalition and try to get along with the Taliban, and I've been working with them now for 5 years, and I get along with them fine.
When you talk about a coalition, of whom?
Well, the Taliban is going to have to come into the Afghan government. You can't keep them out. So, I mean, Karzai is going to collapse. As soon as we withdraw in 2014, he's going to leave. He's already bought a villa or a house in London. He can't stay there. The Tajiks aren't strong enough to protect him.
So he's planning on getting out before they get him.
You know, he can only run 2 terms. This is his 2nd term, so he can't run for president again unless he changes the Constitution.
Do you believe that our withdrawal and the end of his term are related in any way?
Well, you know, it's coincidental, to say the least. Yeah.
So who is going to run this
There is
country?
nobody. There is nobody, and it'll be civil war to try to find who that person is.
One person, you think?
Well, you know, obviously you need a single image, a leader that has the strength to lead a country.
Is there one?
No, there really isn't. And it's going to have to be Pashto because they're the dominant tribe. And we've disenfranchised the Pashtus so badly, you know, Karzai speaks to them in Farsi.
Really?
You know, even though he is a Pashto, he doesn't use his own language. You know, and he was really raised in America. He's been in America for 17 years.
Is he Iranian?
No, he's Pashto. But all of the educated Afghans, be it Pathan or Tajik, had to use Farsi because that was the only language you could get textbooks. You know, the Pashto language is basically an unwritten language. There is no way to educate yourself. So, you know, and the Taliban doesn't want you educated. The only education the Taliban wants you to have is the Quran.
That you get in the madrasas, too.
I talked to young high school. I was in Kandahar in 2001 when the Taliban had just left. And I talked to young kids who had been in high school under the Taliban. And they said it was so terrible. They came in, they made us, before we were studying science and math and English, and it was really fun. They came in and they said, we spent all day on 1 page of the Quran. And when we complained, and that's all they studied, this is high school, and when we complained, the mullah who was teaching the class said, okay, tomorrow we're going to spend 2 days on the next page.
That's really interesting. This brings up kind of an interesting question in my mind, though. If they speak Farsi, are there many Iranians in Afghanistan?
You know, the Iranians have had a big influence in that country because of the similar language. Yeah. And that must be the Persian Empire spread that far
that's right.
And brought their language with them. And there is a connection there, but these are the minority tribes that speak. Only 2 of the 5 tribes, the Azoris and the Tajik, speak Pashto. Pardon me, speaks Farsi. So they don't have the influence that the Pashtus have. But all the educated Pashtus speak Farsi.
Has Afghanistan made any progress? We've been there, 8 years, 10 years?
No, we've been there 10 years.
10 years.
Longest war we've ever been in.
I know that. Have they made any progress at all that will last?
No, they've gone backwards. We've funded such corruption that it's just barbaric there now. You know, I mean, Before they had corruption, but it was small. In fact, actually, when the Taliban was in power, and I speak to the people, and I ask them these questions. You know, two guys with a bit of rubber cable would control the crowd in the main mosque of thousands of people. Now Karzai's got, you know, M50 caliber machine guns and rocket launchers, and he can't control the crowds. So, you know, in a sense, we've created so much corruption. So much corruption, the police, the government, and we've funded it to the tune of how many, $4 trillion we've spent there. So you can imagine the corruption that's
Whose pockets does all that money go in?
Oh, you know, I was in, a good friend of mine sells real estate, and the governor, all the political figures, but the governor of Mazar had stolen so much money, and they don't like to keep the cash, they like real estate, so it's funded this really artificial real estate market. And he'd bought a piece of property, really worth not much, but he paid $4 million in downtown Kabul. And he was arguing, my friend's a broker, he was arguing with Karzai's brother Wally, who wanted to buy it for $6 million. And he'd only owned it a week. And his comment when he refused the $6 million, he said, it took me months to find someplace to put the $4 million. What am I going to do with the $6 million?
Isn't that
That's how much money they've stolen.
Isn't that just something? I cannot.
You know, in Dubai, in fact, I don't know if you're familiar with that area, but in the UAE, was successful not because they had oil wealth, because Dubai doesn't have any oil, only Abu Dhabi has oil, but because they became a money laundering city. You know, they were the Switzerland of the Middle East. That's where everybody put their money. So the real estate market there flourished until the Americans came in and shut down.
Yeah, but they don't know what to do with all this money that they have floating around. What is the future? What is the future for Afghanistan?
Oh, you know, I think the traditional Taliban will take over again. And as they have in the provinces, I think they'll come into the cities and have more control.
Now, are we talking about Wahhabi Taliban?
I hope not. I hope we haven't disenfranchised with it. You know, we had, as a trucker or someone who moves the Army's goods around, we go to 720 FOBs, forward operating bases. I was much safer on the highway 2 years ago, before the surge, because really all we accomplished with the surge was we alienated more of the local people via drone bombings from 70,000 feet that killed, you know, a wedding party, or you know, what we call the shooters, the 102nd and the 82nd Airborne and the Special Forces, kicking in doors.
So you're not very positive about the future for Afghanistan.
The push was a failure. Yeah. It was, and McChrystal told us that. His resignation, and he was a military man. He wasn't a politician like Petraeus. Yeah. You know, and I've met both those gentlemen, and you know, they both have different agendas. One was a politician, wanted to, you know, make things work, and McChrystal was a Special Forces general. He wanted to solve the problem with military force.
And it's not good or bad, but it's just different.
It's different,
and
really, the problem was McChrystal wasn't given the right to do that. Wally Karzai, who controlled Kandahar before he was shot, told McChrystal, "You can't come into Kandahar. Your troops cannot come into my city," and he couldn't cross the Paki border. So here he was, and he had to tell everybody he was going to do this because he wanted the civilians to leave. So all the Taliban left behind were suicide bombers, snipers, and IEDs.
Chris, it's a very tangled web.
It is. It is.
And it is not going to be a beautiful future.
Yeah.
For
you know, and the thing that hurts me the most, having invested as much time as I have in that country, is that I see our effort over there being driven mostly by military contractors and their interest in the dollar. You know, I mean, that $4 trillion budget that we've spent over there, a lot of that was taken by military contracts. The Army doesn't fix its own meals anymore. They don't build their own bunks. They don't change light bulbs. That's all farmed out. I know right now we have 100,000 U.S. soldiers in country and 160,000 contractors like myself.
That's a lot. That is truly.
At much, much higher wages than the soldiers are ever being paid. And the companies that are running the contractors like myself. Now, I work for an Afghan company, but the American contracting companies are making
tons.
Yeah.
Of our,
taxpayers' money. I know I spoke to an auditor, a congressional auditor, who was trying to investigate this, and he said that he could not get a contractor to actually tell him how much they charge to put a light bulb.
It varies from day to day.
His best guess was $500.
Ooh. I'll do it for $500. I will take these poor old bones and climb up that ladder and change those light bulbs for $500 a day. Well, thank you, Chris. I would say thank you for being with us. You know, it's our community. We have very interesting neighbors, and I wanted you to meet Chris Turner, and he's going back to Afghanistan next week.
Yeah, on Tuesday.
and we wish you well.
Thank you so much.
And we wish the Afghanis well, indeed. They are basically good people, and we wish them well. So thank you for being with us. It's our community, and we'll see you soon again. Bye.